On a previous episode, I talked about that one of the features of American Christianity is that it tends to be restorationist. And the restorationist viewpoint in religion is that there is some privileged era of the past that was the time when that religious expression was at its optimal place, and that any deviation from that has been a digression. So for some people and for some Protestants, then the period of the Reformation is that privileged place, that privileged time. And depending on the kind of Protestant, it's an era of a few decades, and most of the great literature of that expression came out of that time. It's when people look back as their kind of a golden age. For Pentecostals, that's usually the early 1900s, 1900 to 1920, and of course for those people in that period, they saw the New Testament itself as the optimum period. And I grew up believing, in Pentecostalism that somehow we had leapfrogged over all of history and had recaptured the New Testament. This is not unique to Pentecostals. Other people believed it too. Seventh-day Adventist, even Mormonism. There's many variations of this, and most expressions are Orthodox Christians, but nonetheless they privilege a certain era of history and they want to restore it. It is the idea that truth is given, particularly spiritual truth is given, and then one cannot diverge in any way from it without being unfaithful to God. So I want to ask, does truth develop? And I believe it does. And but there's right and wrong ways that truth can develop. Truth is a deposit. And it's not so much the truth itself develops, but our understanding of what has been deposited begins to unfold. I often make comparisons with American culture, that when the framers of American Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and all these people, when they were creating this country, they had no idea about hot dogs and hamburgers and all that. But jazz, they didn't have any jazz. So these things developed out of the experience of unpacking what the framers had given to us as a nation. And this is true of Christianity itself. For example, the New Testament writers didn't have a New Testament, that's obvious, but it may surprise you to know that also the first century believers did not have a New Testament. Oh, they had a New Testament if you'd ask them, do you have a New Testament? But they would not have thought of it as a book. They were thought of it as the new covenant that God had made with humanity through Christ. The New Testament as a collection of writings was slow to develop, as over many hundreds of years. I don't mean to imply that the writings themselves were not available or were not read. Of course they were, right from the beginning. But there was what we call canon. A canon means the formally recognized collection. So Christians agree on the 66 canon. All Christians of all stripes believe on the 66 books of the canon. But then many churches, including the most ancient churches, have what they call a deuterocanonical collection. Deuterocanonical means second canon. And that includes what Protestants call the Apocrypha, and which we used to print in our Bibles as Protestants. Your great-grandmother's family Bible has the Apocrypha, but mostly due to technology and just convenience, they were dropped, and also because they were not thought of as being canonical to Protestants, to most Protestants. There are Protestants that believe in the deuterocanonical scriptures and use them. Okay, so how does things develop? So I mentioned the canon. I could mention other things that were developments in Christianity early on. But the canon represents one of the most important aspects of this. Christianity also developed by just the hymns that were written. Christians have sung since the beginning, so we have collections of music that go all the way back. In most old expressions of Christianity, that first selection of hymnody is actually the Psalms. So all the Psalms have melodies to them. That's true in Judaism, it's true in Orthodoxy, it's true in Catholicism, it's true in early Anglican expressions, that each psalm has a melody. But then those psalms began to be paraphrased, and after a while we had the great hymns. Isaac Watts, for example, is a great hymn writer, and most of his hymns were paraphrases of psalms. So how does truth develop? Well, there's good ways and bad ways. If a boy becomes a man, that is a development. Puberty changes a boy into a man or girl into a woman. If a man changes back into a boy, that usually doesn't happen physically. I don't know of any time that has occurred. Puberty is pretty much irreversible, but sometimes mentally we can say someone is having a second childhood. It means that they have lost certain aspects of their reason that we attach to adulthood. That's a development that's not good. So sometimes a recovery of earlier periods is not actually a sign of health. So we have to look at that. But there are also other kinds of development. If I grow a second nose or a third eye, I guess some religions say I have a third eye, but I haven't found it yet. If I do. But if I grow an eye in the middle of my head, I'm going to be an object of an awful lot of discussion in the world. People want to I'll be very popular, and to science anyway, and maybe to my family and friends that it'll be a little more disconcerting. Sometimes Christianity kind of develops in that way, and so we say there's a sect. A sect can say we're going to do things a little differently. They're still obviously Christian, but then they can go another step and maybe have a new piece of scripture or practices that are at real variance with the rest of Christian faith, and they slip from being a sect into a cult. So that's a wrong kind of development. In our country, you can look back and see where deliberate choices were made. For example, after the Second World War, President Eisenhower wrestled with whether he should encourage the development of a more contemporary, up-to-date mass transit system in the nation, or whether we should go with the private automobile and develop that infrastructure more. Of course, he took the route of the interstate system, which was President Eisenhower's single greatest presidential achievement. That changed our country in drastic ways. You can imagine if he would have decided on fast railway systems and that infrastructure developed more for public transportation. Some people would have preferred that, some people not, but you could see that it would have changed the culture in very considerable ways. So sometimes a development is, it just takes you down an alternate track. It doesn't change who you are that much, except the kind of outward expressions. And sometimes it can change you very drastically. And so if Christianity develops in ways that is at variance with the deposit of faith that's already at the core of Christianity, then we call that heresy. It's moving away from the common deposit of faith we all share. If, on the other hand, a development is simply a new understanding, for example, slavery was tolerated even though it wasn't preferred through a lot of Christian history. And as we know in our own country, there was even defenses made from Scripture for slavery. But finally, it's pretty well determined by everybody, hopefully you, that slavery is not consistent with Christianity. So there was an unpacking of this, like, no, this is not good. The Constitution of the United States says in order to form a more perfect union. So it's the idea that things can be perfected on this in this political sense in the United States, that we are sometimes we discover things that seem to be inherent in the original deposit that maybe our grandparents did not have to wrestle with or have not wrestled with. So I think that's an important piece as we talk about coping with change. As Christians, we have to decide what kind of changes can be made in our faith that, for example, if we drop potlucks and no longer have potlucks, that you may regret that, but that's not an essential loss of faith. If we change our music, that's not an essential loss of faith. It might be a loss. It might also be a gain. It can be a gain and a loss, but it doesn't mean the faith itself has changed. But if we decide that the resurrection didn't occur, well, that's a drastic change that alters the faith itself. And so we want to distinguish between what kind of changes just tweak my particular expression of Christianity is in ways that are uncomfortable to me in order to connect with the present era and time, or what sort of changes may be occurring that is actually at the core of the faith itself. And it's an important distinguishing thing to decide. So thanks for tuning in. I enjoy your comments back, and hopefully these are of some benefit to you.